Hi folks, welcome to this first episode of Roads to a Happy Mind. And there are many roads, as you can see here. Looking at the Herbal Database, we've tracked out all these different routes to mental peace, happiness, well-being. And we're starting out with this first section called Mental Health and Disorders. It's kind of a general heading. Linked to it are different causes of mental distress, different kinds of disorders, and what can help us to overcome them to maintain a state of happiness, which is really what we're all striving towards. So we're going to open up the information panel here in the database and take a look at some of the general information that we find there. These are links to a few interesting studies. For example, drumming mediates mental health recovery. You can see another one here about the role of our gut flora or microbiota in actually modulating neuropsychological function of the central nervous system. Look, there's even an upside of worrying. You might want to click on that one right away. And then this is curious. Is mental health associated with perception of nasal function? Now, another link that is really, really good is this interview with Dr. Jay Faber. We learned that 26% of us have some kind of mental health issue going on. And as far as what's causing it, well, it's an interplay. Genes can be involved, environmental factors, toxins, and our society needs to find ways to increase resilience, to increase hope. So in this interview, we learn about Dr. Faber's holistic psychiatric practice. It's through the Amen Clinic. There are several locations around the country. I think the Cleveland Clinic is the only comparable clinic that uses a holistic approach, and that means that they are really working to get to the root of the problem. It's using lifestyle. Yes, they'll use medication sometimes when it's really kind of an emergency, but they make an effort to be sure that it's a safe use of these psychoactive drugs. And they also use supplements. In diagnosing a patient, they use something called a SPECT scan, and that looks at the blood flow into the brain. Some regions are getting too much blood, others aren't getting enough, and they can tell about what is going on in terms of this blood flow, and they're able to correct it using lifestyle, using certain herbs. For example, they use saffron, St. John's wort, and a few other supplements. And after they've made the diagnosis, they figure out where the patient stands in terms of their readiness for change, using a model called the 8 Stages of Change, which is also located here in the database, because people are not actually ready to change until they reach what's called the action stage. And when patients come in, they aren't necessarily there yet. So Dr. Faber and his associates help people get to that point where they are at the action stage and ready to take their lives back. So once the symptoms are improved, they go on to help the person develop a purpose in life, enthusiasm, vitality. And so this is really an example of psychiatric practice at its best. Next, we have an article highlighting herbs that can help us prevent mental illness from happening in the first place. And some of the herbs that they talk about are, for example, an herb from Central and South America called malungu bark. And it's something that helps reduce anxiety, and it actually protects brain function. It inhibits anxiety without any side effects and doesn't affect basic motor skills. It also increases a very strong physical sensation of well-being, and it can be taken on its own or with a stimulant like green tea to amplify its effect. So it gives mental clarity and improves brain function. Then we've also got mucuna. That's been used in Ayurveda for a long time, known as velvet bean, and it contains L-DOPA, which is a biochemical precursor to several neurotransmitters. Now, dopamine is one of those neurotransmitters in addition to adrenaline and noradrenaline, and it supports improved brain function, increased memory, and regulates mood and cognition. It's widely known as an anti-aging herb. It's antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and it has anti-inflammatory effect towards the protection of neurons. So it fights something called redness or inflammation in the brain, which is one of the symptoms of brain degradation. Then it also covers passion flower, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. Passion flower is great for helping with sleep disorders and even seizures. It's another one that's really good for anxiety. And then it gets into one of our best nervines called skullcap. And skullcap can be very helpful for certain mental disorders, but it has mood-enhancing properties, and it again protects the brain against damaging effects caused by inflammation. Then, of course, we can't leave out kava kava. Kava does have psychoactive qualities. It's got a non-narcotic type action against anxiety. It doesn't affect heart rate or blood pressure. And it's also been helpful in things like migraines, ADHD, people with psychosis, depression, chronic fatigue syndrome. And then we can't leave out ginseng. Ginseng is amazing for so many reasons, but one of the things that it can do is decrease the stress hormone cortisol, and it can help calm you down and boost your energy without being overstimulating. It too improves brain function and concentration. It helps with memory issues and protects against age-related mental decline. It works as an antioxidant, and it protects the brain cells against free radical damage. Of course, it's really important to learn about these herbs before using them, and the database will give you all of the information you need, including any contraindications, what types of constitutions they're most appropriate for, doses, etc. And so let's move on to the next link here. The World Health Organization identified Denmark as one of the happiest countries in the world. Now that could be due to a state of mind practice that they've been using for many centuries called hygge. So this article gives us some ideas on how we could use this practice in our own lives. It's an old practice that's gaining traction outside of its origin. It's meant to promote a feeling of contentment. And as the rest of the world seems to be slowly waking up to what the Danes have been wise to for generations, that having a relaxed, cozy time with friends and family, often with coffee, cake, or beer, can be good for the soul, hygge seems to be about being kind to yourself, indulging, having a nice time, not punishing or denying yourself anything. There isn't so much enforced deprivation in Denmark. Instead, you're kinder to yourselves and so to each other. So there are 4 simple ways outlined in this article. You can come to the database and take a look at it, but just very briefly, just make spaces in your home hygge friendly. Coziness and intimacy can be felt in spaces that seem lived in. Make them warm. Create a space for solitude. Do things like take an evening bath lit by candlelight. Curl up with your cat on the couch and listen to soft music. Eat comfort food for the soul. It's good for it. It gets a bad rap, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can be earthy flavors like a vegetable farro, risotto, or a steaming cup of tea. These things promote coziness. And then enjoy quality time with family and friends. Don't just leave it to holidays and big events, but incorporate your nearest and dearest regularly to promote love. And then, of course, enjoy the great outdoors. Next comes a study that we really ought to be aware of, that mental illness associated with early childhood adversity can be passed from generation to generation. And this was based on a study of adults whose parents evacuated Finland as children during World War II. And there have been other studies along the same lines. So especially the daughters are affected. There are chemical alterations in gene expression without any changes in underlying DNA. So just be aware that if someone has that kind of a background, not themselves even, but their mothers, their grandmothers, their grandfathers, all the way back several generations, they might need some extra support. Next, we come to an excellent presentation by the thyroid pharmacist. She explains how thyroid disease often masquerades as mental illness, and it really is pretty common. So anyone who's having problems with even OCD or depression, they really need to have their thyroid checked, and the usual methods, the usual thyroid tests are not adequate. There are 5 stages of Hashimoto's, and symptoms can show up in the second stage where they're just not going to show any changes in thyroid hormone. Although, if there were tests done on thyroid antibodies or certain types of biopsies, they could detect it, and at that stage it's really easy to prevent it from progressing to full-blown Hashimoto's. And one of the interesting things about Hashimoto's, it's typically thought of as a hypothyroid disorder, and the symptoms are things like brain fog, gaining weight, being super tired. But with Hashimoto's, there can be both hypothyroid and hyperthyroid symptoms, like weight loss, for example, as hyperthyroid. In the video, she discusses some of the things that can be done to correct it, including, for example, the use of selenium supplements combined with another supplement called myo-inositol. It improves the effect of the selenium, and this can actually halt the progression into Hashimoto's, especially stage 5, where other autoimmune conditions can pop up, like rheumatoid arthritis. So we want to get to the root cause. And she also points out that a lot of the psychoactive drugs that are given, the SSRIs and other drugs, actually make the thyroid worse. So in the beginning stages, a person can be misdiagnosed as having major depressive disorder or OCD or even bipolar, and be given these drugs that will harm the thyroid and make Hashimoto's worse. And because it's due to the thyroid, they're just not going to respond to the drugs. They're not going to get better. The bottom line there is a return to mental health and happiness requires having the thyroid checked with the tests that are used in functional medicine to determine if that's the cause, and then fix it. To continue to dig into the topic, we have another documentary here. It's a science documentary on mental disorders, brain trauma, stress, and anxiety. It's a documentary on the brain. I'm going to move on to this other link, which is what you need to know about the connection between sugar and your mental health. After that, there's a good video by Sanjay on his top 5 herbs for mental clarity. It does turn out to be more than 5. He does a good job of separating them into 2 categories. So for people who have brain fog, he describes the energetics behind brain fog, that kind of cloudy-headedness, and what types of herbs can be useful to clear that. And then another type of mental clarity issue is when somebody's just really, really scattered. So in a nutshell, what he recommends is for brain fog to go with herbs like sweet flag, gaducola, bacopa, and rosemary. And then for the scattered, high energy state where you can't focus, you're distracted, you can't zero in on a singular activity and do one thing, he suggests, again, gaducola and lemon balm and milky oats. And then he goes into some detail about the energetics behind these herbs. Let's turn to a really great resource available here called Inner Compass. It's the Inner Compass Initiative, and what it does is provide information, resources, tools, and even connecting platforms to help people make more informed choices regarding all things mental health, and to support individuals and groups around the world who want to leave, bypass, or build community beyond the mental health system. So that's a group that's really energized to make change happen. You can join them to help them do that. Your experiences, your story, your voice matters, so that's a good place to get involved if this is something important to you. They believe that in each person there's innate wisdom, what they call the inner compass, and that when that wisdom is listened to, it helps us navigate the difficulties of being human. But the mental health industry, with its medicalized model of mental illness and mental health, its pharmaceuticalized and institutionalized standards of care, its massive promotional and public relations apparatus, plus its legalized authority and its professionalization of health has influenced many people to ignore and lose touch with this inner wisdom. So I think we'll stop there. Yes, there's much more in this section of the database to explore, and we'll dig into some other topics in the next video. So thank you for joining me, and remember, subscribe to the database and you'll have all of this at your fingertips.